AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes from AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Leon Carroll. Leon served as a Marine Corps officer, and after leaving the Marine Corps, had a 20-year career as an officer in the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, serving in 7 different locations, including afloat. And toward the end of his career, he was actually the special agent in charge, both in the Pacific Northwest and in Panama City. Since retiring from NCIS, Leon has been the technical advisor to the famous TV series with Mark Harmon. And more recently, Leon and Mark have come up with a series of books, and we've already interviewed them twice on the earlier books, Ghosts of Honolulu and Ghosts of Panama. They have a brand new book coming out in mid-April entitled Ghosts of Sicily. I just finished reading it, and it is a fascinating read. Leon, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Hey, Jim, thanks for having me back. Much appreciated.
Leon, this is a little bit of a different topic. How did you choose this subject?
Jim, this is a little different. We did go back to World War II, and as we've chosen most of our books, we went back to the NCIS Association's site, history site, where they have all kinds of events that NCIS, mainly ONI and NIS were involved in, because we're talking history. And we picked out a few of those books, and we had our first one, Ghost of Honolulu, which we highlighted Doug Wada, and then the Ghost of Panama, which we highlighted Rick Yell and the people that were assigned in Panama just before I arrived. And now we have Ghost of Sicily, which is a lot different. And the way we came up with this is through an outline that was done that appeared on that site by Admiral Tom Brooks. We read that and we thought, wow, this would be a great story to tell, because no one would ever have believed that the United States military, Navy, would be involved in recruiting people from the Mafia to help us in World War II. So we thought that would be the key. And although there had been books written about this topic in the past, when we talked to Admiral Brooks, he had read all of these books, and he said, hey, there have been books that have been written, but if you guys could focus on what the NCIS ONI officers did at that time, then I think that would be a lot more interesting for a person that's reading the books. So we did, and we've always wanted to highlight things that are done by little known people, but involved in big things. And in this case, we were able to pull that off a third time.
Leon, you begin the book with a very interesting device, and it's actually the murder of a young Jewish police officer in New York City sometime before World War II by an Italian mobster.
That's correct. He was on watch, and this appeared in a Brooklyn newspaper, which gives credit to our research team, because later in the book, we actually bring in the pertinence of having this at the front of the book. But yes, he was killed actually at a site where he thought some illegal activity was going. And there were 2 people that were involved, the father and the son. And the father ended up doing time from the son. And we'll learn about more of that later in the book, because it does, come into play later.
So fast forward to the beginning of World War II. What drove ONI to undertake some very unconventional relationships to protect East Coast ports?
Well, as you probably know, and other intelligence officers, our apparatus after World War I to really know what was going on in the rest of the world was pretty slim. In World War II, pre-World War II, we knew that things were going on with the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. And we weren't involved early on in World War II, but we could sense things were happening. And what was one of the things that was happening was the offshore sinking of merchant ships coming out of the east coast of the United States, mainly going to Europe and Northern Africa, to help support the World War II effort for Europe. And so O&I basically decided, hey, we need to find out if, in fact, the Germans, in this case specifically, had sent anybody ashore to infiltrate the New York City fishing market and shipping industry. And that's how this all got started. And the key thing, there was a ship that blew up in New York City and Brooklyn, actually. And I think that really caught folks' attention. And so O&I, the District Intelligence Office, District 3, started an operation to try to recruit people to counter that.
Who were some of the principal O&I officers involved, and what were their roles?
Okay, let's start with how the operation really got started. There was a captain by the name of McFall who was a district intelligence officer, and he had a subordinate, a lieutenant commander by the last name of Hoffman. And actually, McFall had gone to the local district attorney and said, hey, we would like to consider having some folks who are not the best people actually look at other people that are working the docks to see if they're spying for either Germany, Italy, or any other non-allied country. And to Halfenden's surprise, that meeting had happened, and then Halfenden had a meeting with them, and they says, "Oh, yeah, by the way, this has already been brought to our attention." And they came up with an idea of recruiting people who had been arrested working on the waterfront. And so with that in mind, initially they looked at who could they recruit. And Joe Sox Landa was the first guy, and he was recruited because he actually he was indicted, but had not been convicted yet of a crime for extortion. As we all know, the Mafia, as we call it, they always were extorting businesses to give them a share of the cut. And he was doing that in the Fulton fish market. And so when they recruited him, to their surprise, with his lawyer, he was willing to do this with the idea for him that he would not have to do time, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was the start with the Mafia side of the house. And then on our side, it was the recruitment and bringing in O&I officers, and we started with civilians who were Navy reservists in intel, and the whole deal, going back to what we were trying to do in the beginning, was to recruit people who were fluent Italian speakers. And that's how we came up with Marsalo, Alfieri, Titolo, and Murray. Murray, obviously not an Italian name, but he was half Italian. And they all were fluent Italian speakers. And in Alfieri's case, he actually knew several different dialects.
Who were some of the principal mobsters involved?
Well, the whole mob thing started, as I said, with Sox Lanza. And by the way, he got that name because he was very good with his hands, not about things he wore on his feet, but his hands. and so when he came in, the initial aspect of it was really about New York and New York City and what was going on the waterfront. That was his thing. Beyond that, he was not much help, but he allowed people, he even allowed naval officers to get union cards, and they were actually at some point doing pickups of some of his money and that type of thing. But the idea was that these people who were working for the government would have access to people who could provide them information about what was going on in the waterfront. When this whole program was being expanded, they were like, well, we need a bigger picture person. And so out of that came the recommendation of Lucky Luciano, who was doing 30 to 40 years in prison for prostitution, right? Now think about that today, 30 to 40 years for prostitution. And today we just had a guy convicted of the same thing that got much less time. Now, the thing about that was obviously that was the only thing they could get Luciano on, because he had people murdered and that type of thing, which I don't think that was the case in the more recent one. But I thought about that and I'm thinking, wow, that's a long time to do for what he was doing, right? So anyway, they didn't know how he would feel about it, but at the time he had been arrested, he was in charge of all the five families. I mean, they all had their own areas, and he had Meyer Lansky, who was Jewish, but he and Luciano pretty much grew up together, and that's how that connection works. So they went to Lansky first, and Lansky says, "Well, let's go up and talk to Lucky and see if he's willing to do it." And I think in his mind, it was more about, can I get clemency? But the other part of that was, can I get closer to home in New York City? Because he had been incarcerated up in Danbury at the upstate New York. And so they went up, they talked to him, and he says, yes. And one of the things I think that we found out in doing this research is, like in our previous books, the people who in some cases were bad, in this case are bad guys, but they were still patriotic to the United States. And most of the people in Sicily and the Sicilians here in the United States were not Mussolini fans, right? And so the patriotism came into play with Luciano, and he says, hey, yes, by all means, I'm in with this. We'll get you the people that can provide you the information. And I don't think he brought up, hey, can I get closer? But the idea was, hey, we don't want to go all the way up here, so let's move him closer to Manhattan. And he ended up at Green Meadows. And so they go back with his next message to them was, hey, next time you come up, you bring Socks up, bring him up Lanza, and let me tell him what to do, and tell him if people don't cooperate with him, let me know and I'll fix it, right? So that's how the Mafia end got started.
What were some of the successes that O&I experienced through this operation in New York City?
Well, primarily, when you look at how all of this got set up, we have the O&I officers who were basically on both ends of the spear, the tip and the handle. And I'll talk about the tip in New York City. They were the ones that were going around getting intelligence. And in some cases, they stood out, right? They weren't the usual dock worker type people. In fact, Marshall had been a lawyer, right? But they were recruiting people on the docks to go out and get information at bars and things that we've done probably for a century or more when it comes to gathering intelligence. So that's basically what they were doing in New York City, and it helped develop this plan, big picture plan, about what was going on in Italy and more specifically, Sicily. And so Hoffenden had a big chart where they would chart out different things in Sicily that was based on information that was given by these informants that these guys had recruited.
What was one of the things that Hoffenden was able to do in New York City to enable support to Allied forces that were preparing for invasion of Sicily?
Well, when they started, I don't know that they had in mind that was going to be the case. I mean, this happens in about 42, 43 time frame, not too long after Pearl Harbor. So I don't think we had the total strategic plan. But Hoffenden knew at some point we would have to do something in Europe that was big and big operations. But he didn't know how the O&I part was going to happen. And in fact, he was going rogue in terms of not informing higher headquarters, and he protected Captain Mafall. So they did very little reporting to D.C., to O&I headquarters in D.C. on a lot of this stuff. And later on in the 50s, they did what's called the Hurlins Report. And they looked back and they were looking at, did Lucky Luciano actually help provide things that were of use to the U.S. government back in the 40s? And a lot of what we found came from the Hurlins Report. But later, when we get into what happens in Italy or off the coast of Italy, you'll see what Hoffenden really had some real good forethought on what he was doing and how they were collecting.
So that basically is part one of the book. Part two is about O&I support for the Allied invasion of both Sicily and Italy. And in particular, some intelligence was already flowing from the O&I office in New York City to the U.S. commander of Mediterranean operations, and Admiral Henry
Admiral
Hewitt.
Hewitt.
Yeah. Once Hewitt started seeing this intelligence that was coming from ONI in New York City, what was the request that Hewitt made of ONI?
Well, to answer that question specifically, it was to have the talent that he saw from the Italian speakers come over and do the job that they did over off the coast of Italy. Prior to that all happening, though, they all had to go, and this is Marslow, these are all Navy lieutenants, Marslow, Tutolo, Alfieri, and Murray were sent to Army counterintelligence training because they probably were the only service that had it in North Africa. So they practiced doing the landings and all kinds of things. And when I mentioned the other about the tip of the spear, so in New York, they were in the planning stage, the strategic. This is the overlook of what was going on in Italy. Now, unlike today, very rarely do you take headquarters kind of people and put them out there with rifles. But that's exactly what happened with these guys. They went through all the combat training and they ended up doing the landings. And in fact, first wave. And I know you're going to get more into what happened with that, but that's what Admiral Hewitt was looking for. Those guys to come in who had that type of experience from New York and recruiting sources that were Italian speakers and doing the same ashore off the and on land in Italy.
So describe what Marcelo and Murray's role was and actions were after they literally landed with the first wave at the Terra de Gaffi landing.
So in both cases, what happened was Marcelo was put in charge. And so they divided up into two teams. And what they did was both went different landings. And when I say landings, I mean with actually Army Rangers going on the Higgins boats ashore. And what they would do is have uniforms on before they go. Now, they hit shore, the uniforms come off, and they go into the local community. Now, the information that they were going after, they had learned in New York because they had people, and Luciano was backbone behind this, telling them, hey, this is my family at the ports that you just mentioned and others, and contact them, even though there was no way really, because we didn't have the phone service and all of that, but maybe letters to people. In some cases, these guys would go up to folks and say, hey, your uncle who lives in such and such and so says I should contact you. And the people that they were talking to were a little bit sometimes surprised. But after a while, they figured out, hey, we don't like Mussolini either. We just got to make sure that you're not double agents on us because they spoke the language. And so they were able to gather information about things ashore. And their whole thing was what we could probably call now force protection, but they called it port security. So that when they hit the beaches, they being the Army Rangers and Army 3rd Infantry Division and the paratroopers on the other side, that they had a safe space to go to. And so that was the whole idea of having just two people and two teams going out with, in some cases, local Italians, mapping out different areas that they felt were safe.
So going back to the beginning of the book, who did Marcelo and Murray meet after the landing on the beach and then moving into town in civilian clothing?
Let's go back to actually maybe 20, 30 years later, before I should say. So the Ricobonos were part of the mob. Joe, the dad, was the one that actually took the hit for his kid for shooting towards the officer that night. To keep the son safe, he ends up being sent to Italy. And he's there for years and years and years. And lo and behold, when our guys hit the shore, 20, 30 years later, he's the guy, one of the guys that they meet, who actually goes on a raid with them to a castle, Castle St. Angelo, I think is the correct name or English name. And it had been used as a headquarters for the Italian military. And by the time they got there, they had already left, but they left in such a hurry that they still left documents. And I know one of the things that ONI officers were noted for were picking locks. And I want to bring this up because it's interesting. When I talked to one of our old time and he became an NIS agent, he's about 100 years old. I asked him, I says, well, what kind of weapons did you guys carry back in World War II, et cetera, into the 50s? And he said, well, we always had to ask the boss if we wanted to take a weapon out, but we were all issued a lock picking kit. And I go, really? He goes, yeah, we trained on picking locks. And going back to your question about how effective they were during World War II, they would actually do surreptitious entries, and they would pick locks not only of doors, but open safes and all of that, and get classified information that was being used by the Allied forces. Same thing happened here. And when I'm laughing because this goes into my TV show, NCIS Origins. I saw a script that said, hey, we're going to go into blowing up this safe. And I go, I don't think you want to blow up a safe lab, right? Because these guys went in and Alfieri was having a hard time lock picking. And so they ended up blowing up a safe and getting documents out of there. So I thought, well, this relates. Maybe I told my guys the wrong thing. Actually, I didn't, because you don't want to blow up a safe or anything in a laboratory. But they were in this castle and they actually blew it up and they were able to get documents that were used later in the operation.
Switching to the other team, Titolo and Alfieri, what were they able to accomplish after they landed?
Well, the whole idea was for them to continue up the coast of Italy from Sicily all the way up to Rome, actually. And what they would do is the same thing. They would try to talk to informants, set up safe landing places for our troops as they were coming ashore. Alfieri was highly decorated, by the way. He received a Legion of Merit, and he was in more operational stuff than we actually document in the book. And he lived quite a long life. He died, I want to say, in the 70s. It was relatively recent. But they were able to find those types of documents and get them to the naval commands, and actually what they call the AAW, Allied something warfare group. And that really helped the Army come ashore. And we're talking high-level Army operations where divisions were landing Naples and north.
So Allied forces were very successful in occupying and liberating Sicily, and German and Italian forces withdrew from Messina back to the Italian mainland, and then came the Allied invasion of Italy in several different locations. And the NCIS officers once again made more landings, this time in Italy.
Yes. In fact, again, the first landing was such a success that the admiral wanted them back. Actually, it was the general that wanted them back to go in ahead of his forces when they landed and set up the same type of port, they called it port security apparatus. And that was all done by talking to local fishermen, relatives of people who and some of them actually had been deported back to Italy, who were in America illegally. And they also would assist in providing information.
So after his second landing, Marcelo had a fairly significant intelligence and I would say also preventative security success involving both Generals Alexander and Clark.
Right. Because of his language capability, he was put with the highest level of commands toward the end of all of this. And he was a translator for some of the actions between the two fighting warring groups, the Italian Navy and our military. And he was given awards for doing that, was recommended very highly by the generals in charge for pretty much translating what was being done in the truce between the two fighting warring groups.
So toward the end of the war, Marcelo and another individual by the name of Crabb actually had a significant success with an Italian dive unit. Tell our audience about that.
Yeah, and this Crabb's nickname was Buster, not the Olympian and Tarzan guy, but a totally different guy who was British, worked for MI6, And he and Marsalo got together. Obviously, again, Marsalo being the Italian speaker could talk to the locals, et cetera, et cetera. But Crabbe was expert diver. And one of the things that they were really concerned with the whole time in all of these ports was whether or not the Italians, Germans had laid mines near these ports, which that had happened. And so Crabbe was involved in going and diving, looking for enemy mines in pretty much all of these ports. But at one, he was with Marsalo, and they became pretty good friends. Later on, unfortunately, Crabbe died in a diving incident. But that was the big thing that happened with them, and we lay it out in a lot more detail in the book. But it was quite interesting because even I had to go back and see, is this the same guy? Because it was the same time frame, but it's a different guy. Maybe I should have left that for the readers to figure out too. I don't know. Readers of the book.
And what would you like to say about what happened to some of the principal characters after World War II?
Two people were actually the two guys that were probably most noted, Alfieri and Marsalo. Marsalo, whose actual Italian name was Marzullo, and he had been a lawyer. And this was the connection between ONI and the district attorney's office. He had actually worked as a civilian with the district attorney's office while he was a naval reservist. And that was the connection between ONI, District Intelligence Office 3, and the district attorney in New York, in Manhattan. So when all of this was over, Marsalo had made so many connections with the mobsters that he became a conduit to the mobsters or whatever. So he lived for maybe 15 years after the war, and his business was making all of these deals that were deals that involved these guys who had been criminals, basically, or had rackets going. And that's what he did. Alfieri stayed with Naval Intelligence as a reservist well into the 50s, maybe even longer, because Admiral Brooks, I do have a picture. Actually, it's not in the book because the quality wasn't good, but a picture of Admiral Brooks, Alfieri, and one other gentleman at a formal. And that would have been taken probably in the 60s, if not the 70s. But he passed away later. But he stuck with ONI and did a great job. Made captain and had a lot of medals. And in fact, a friend of mine, I asked, God, he may have passed away even later, because another fellow agent of mine who was an ONI officer was actually at his funeral. So it had to have been probably 70s, 80s time frame.
Well, the name of the book is Ghosts of Sicily. It is a fascinating read. I recommend it to you all. And I want to thank both Leon Carroll and Mark Harmon for doing another great book.
Tim, thanks for having me on, and I hope everyone buys the book. I think if you're a World War II buff, and even if you've read the other books, this one we did because we wanted people to know what our officers, and a lot of times people don't know the difference between intelligence officers and criminal. For me, it was a surprise when I became an NCIS agent that NIS actually was the Navy's arm for counterintelligence. And that arm comes all the way back from the days of ONI. And these guys were the real stars, the real heroes that are out there at the tip of the spear, and we wanted to pay them homage.
Thanks again.
All right. You're welcome. Anytime, Jim. Thank you.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.